Hello, and welcome to this weekend's special episode of Views of an Outsider, our Independence Day. As you can probably hear, my voice is still not back at 100%, but at least it's drastically improved from last week. And life waits for no man, so we press ahead. Before we get into today's special episode, which is meant to help all of us get into the right spirit to be able to fully appreciate all that we have to be grateful for as we prepare to celebrate the coming 4th of July, I think we should start off by reading the single page that we celebrate each year on this day. The Declaration was officially written to King George, but it was written just as much for the signer's fellow colonists. In actuality, the Declaration was really intended for the entire world to read its words. Its goal was to rally the troops, win some foreign allies, and announce to the world the birth of our new nation, the United States of America. The Declaration opened with a defense of the legitimacy of the colonists' right to move forward with the revolution under the circumstances that they would lay out. They invoked the rights that are gifted to all men by a higher power, greater even than that of kings. And then the Declaration proceeded to list 27 grievances that the colonies had against King George III. These were cited as evidence of the justness of their cause in rebelling against his authority and choosing to form their own nation instead. This glorious document finished by declaring a complete break with the monarchy of Britain and claiming for its own people the power of an independent and sovereign nation from that moment forward. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same objective, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient suffering of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former system of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to tend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions from within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payments of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the work of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous age, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. At every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in our attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and holds them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We rightly laud our founding fathers who signed this incredible declaration. But how much do most of us actually know about them? 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. They signed it as underdogs in a revolution that they knew they would probably lose, facing the greatest superpower that the world knew at the time. They did so knowing that history is written by the victors, and if they lost, which they probably would, they would be remembered not as heroes, not as freedom fighters, but as traitors to their king and country. And each and every one of those magnificent men still put their John Hancock on that piece of paper, and yes, that is where that saying comes from. As we prepare to celebrate this 4th of July, nearly 250 years later, let us consider all that we owe to these men, and take the briefest glance at the heroes who signed that declaration on the first 4th of July, 249 years ago. 4 of those 56 signers were doctors, 24 were lawyers, 1 was a printer, and 1 started his life in America as an indentured servant. The rest were mostly merchants and plantation owners. 2 of those signers went on to become the President of the United States. Both of them died on the same day, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1826. 8 of the signers were immigrants who were born in Europe. 12 of them had their homes burned to the ground by the British. 5 of them were captured by the British and were tortured and eventually died. Many of them had their properties and fortunes seized, and they were completely bankrupt when they died. 3 of them lost their own children on the battlefields of the revolution that they started. Freedom isn't free, and our founding fathers paid a very high price for the inheritance that they passed on to us. Preserving this freedom still requires sacrifices, and even more than that, it requires commitment. A commitment to preserve the freedom that we have been blessed with. Because as Ronald Reagan pointed out, those who allowed themselves to lose their freedom never knew it again. So, in order, here are the men who signed the Declaration of Independence for us. Georgia. Button Gwinnett was the first man to sign for the colony of Georgia. He was born in England to a Welsh father, and he was one of the men who signed the famous parchment copy of the Declaration on August 2nd, not on July 4th. During his service in the Continental Congress, Gwinnett was a candidate for brigadier general to lead the 1st Regiment in the Continental Army, but he lost out to his rival McIntosh. This public loss to his worst enemy greatly embittered Gwinnett, and he sought to undermine his opponent. Tensions reached a boiling point when the Assembly approved Gwinnett's attack on British Florida, making him the superior commander of McIntosh. Things deteriorated further when Gwinnett had McIntosh's brother charged with treason. He also ordered McIntosh to lead an invasion of East Florida, which failed. This caused McIntosh to publicly call Gwinnett a scoundrel and a lying rascal. So Gwinnett challenged McIntosh to a duel. The two men squared off and exchanged pistol shots at 12 paces. Both were wounded. Gwinnett eventually died of his wounds on May 19, 1777. McIntosh, although wounded, recovered and went on to live until 1806. He was never charged with Gwinnett's death. Gwinnett's autograph is highly sought after by collectors who are seeking a complete set of all 56 signers. His signature is extremely rare, with only 51 known examples, and only 10 of those are in private hands. One of his letters sold for $51,000 in 1927, a record that stood for over 45 years. In 1979, a new record of $100,000 was paid for a receipt that had been signed by him. Lyman Hall also signed for Georgia. He graduated from Yale and then studied theology under his uncle. He preached for 2 years, but he was dismissed for his immoral behavior, which he confessed to. His repentance was believed to be sincere, so he was reinstated, and he preached for another 2 years before giving up the ministry in order to study medicine. In 1756, he followed the Dorchester Puritans to the newest colony in America, Georgia. There he became the owner of a small plantation. In their ignorance, his fellow settlers chose land near the swamps that were full of alligators and snakes, not to mention rife with malaria, so Hall found plenty of work as a doctor in his new home. As a respected preacher and doctor, his community followed Hall's lead in supporting the Liberty Boys. Georgia was so new that it wasn't even represented in the Continental Congress until 1775, which was when Hall was chosen to represent them. He signed a declaration on August 2nd and continued serving the people of his colony until 1780, when the British troops overran Georgia. At that point, he fled with his wife and son after being advised to do so by George Washington. Hall's plantation and his slaves were confiscated by the British, and he was unable to return home for 2 long years, resulting in great financial losses for him. When he eventually returned home in 1783, he was elected governor of Georgia. He agreed to serve for 1 year so that he could clean up the messes that had been left by the war. Then he resumed his medical practice and began to prosper again. He died at the age of 67, and his wife and only son both died within a year of him. As a result, Lyman Hall has no direct descendants. George Walton was the last man to sign for Georgia. He was orphaned at the age of 12 and then apprenticed as a carpenter, where he was denied a candle at night to read by. But his desire to learn was so great that he used his spare time to hunt for sticks that he could burn instead. After his apprenticeship ended, he moved to the new colony of Georgia for the greater opportunities that were available there. He began working in an office where he learned the law, and he eventually became both a lawyer and a master mason. He also became an ardent patriot, and when Georgia was finally represented in the Continental Congress, he was sent there as one of the delegates from that colony. He received a commission as a colonel in the militia, and he was present at the surrender of Savannah to the British. Walton was wounded in battle and taken prisoner, but he was later exchanged. He was also elected as governor, but he only served for a few months. Walton was a passionate supporter of McIntosh in his feud with fellow Georgia delegate Button Gwinnett. And even though he had been elected to Congress, Walton was forced to leave over his involvement in their duel. It seems that Walton had sent a forged letter to Congress, which led to McIntosh being fired from the military, for which he blamed Gwinnett. McIntosh literally horsewhipped Walton for this, and he was then court-martialed. Walton was appointed to several other posts during his life, negotiating with the Cherokee and the Creek Indians before retiring to private life. He died in 1804, and although he left behind children, he too no longer has any living descendants. North Carolina. William Hooper was the first man to sign for North Carolina. He was a lawyer and the son of a Scottish minister who studied at the University of Edinburgh before immigrating to the New World. He married Anne Clark, and they had 3 children together. Hooper had been initially labeled as a loyalist, so he was not immediately accepted by his fellow patriots. Much of his time was split between the Congress and North Carolina, where Hooper was forming a new government. This caused him to miss the vote which approved the Declaration of Independence, but Hooper arrived in time to sign it on August 2nd. In 1777, Hooper resigned from office because of financial concerns, and he resumed his law career. Throughout the Revolution, the British attempted to capture him, and he was forced to move his family to Wilmington. In 1781, the British captured Wilmington, and Hooper wound up separated from his family. The British also burned both of his estates, so Hooper was forced to rely on friends to nurse him back to health when he contracted malaria. Finally, after a year apart, Hooper was reunited with his family. After the Revolution, he returned to his career in law, but he had fallen out of favor with the public. He chose to align himself with the Federalist Party because of his influential connections and his mistrust of the lower class, and he was widely criticized for his soft dealings with Loyalists. Hooper's kind and fair treatment of them caused some people to label him a Loyalist himself. Despite all of these scandals, he was called back to service again in 1786, when he was appointed to judge a border dispute between New York and Massachusetts. Hooper died in 1790. Joseph Hughes also signed for North Carolina. His parents were Quakers, and when he died, his death was recorded in his home meeting, which showed that they at least still regarded him as one of their own. The Continental Congress voted to separate from Britain on July 2nd, 1776, and on July 4th, the official wording of the Declaration was ratified. A copy was ordered on July 19th to be penned by a skilled calligrapher, and most of the signatures were signed on this copy on August 2nd, including that of Hughes. He wrote in a letter from Philadelphia on July 8th, "I had the weight of North Carolina on my shoulders within a day or two of 3 months. The service was too severe. I have sat some days from 6 in the morning until 5 and sometimes 6 in the afternoon without eating or drinking. My health is bad. Such close attention made it worse." Hughes did not take the decision to seek independence lightly, knowing that there would be a high cost for it that would be paid in human pain and suffering. However, his work to organize the Navy began well before July, indicating his willingness early on to support the idea of a revolution. 7 months before the signing, the Continental Congress had created a 7-member committee to begin fitting out 2 vessels, one with 20 guns and the other with 26. Hughes was appointed to this committee and to 2 others, which later evolved into the Marine Committee. Hughes died on November 10th, 1779, 8 months short of his 50th birthday. He was buried with Masonic funeral honors. John Penn likewise signed for North Carolina. He was a lawyer who served several terms in the Continental Congress. His father had not considered education to be important, but after his father's death when he was just 18, Penn privately read law with his uncle, and he became a lawyer. He married and had 3 children. Then he was elected to the Continental Congress, and he was re-elected 3 more times, where he is said to have served with distinction. In 1780, Penn was appointed to the North Carolina Board of War, after which he practiced law until his death in 1788. South Carolina. Edward Rutledge was the first man to sign for South Carolina, and at 26 years old, he was also the second youngest signer of the Declaration, only 3 months older than the youngest signer. Rutledge became the 39th governor of South Carolina. He studied law in London and was admitted to the English bar, then returned to Charleston to practice. He married Henrietta Middleton, and they had 3 children. He also owned more than 50 slaves. He even worked to have African Americans expelled from serving in the Continental Army. During the American Revolution, Rutledge served along with his brother in the Continental Congress. Although he was a firm supporter of colonial rights, he is said to have opposed Richard Henry Lee's resolution of independence. Rutledge served as a captain of artillery in the South Carolina militia, and he fought at the Battle of Beaufort in 1779. In 1780, Rutledge was captured during the siege of Charleston, along with his co-signers Arthur Middleton and Thomas Hayward, Jr., and they were all taken to St. Augustine. They were eventually released during a prisoner exchange in July 1781. After his release, Rutledge continued to serve in politics until 1796, during which time he was known for advocating for confiscation of property belonging to Loyalists. Rutledge also served in the state Senate for 2 years and then as governor. But while away attending an important meeting in Columbia, he had to be sent home because of his gout, and he died in Charleston before the end of his term. Some said at the time that Rutledge died from an apoplexy, or a stroke, after hearing the news that George Washington had died. Thomas Heyward, Jr. also signed for South Carolina. He was a lawyer who had been educated at home before traveling to England to study the law. Heyward was elected to the Continental Congress in 1775, and he was the very last of the 56 delegates to sign the Declaration. Heyward then served as a judge, presiding over a trial in which several people were tried for treason. They were convicted and then executed in full view of the British lines. During the siege of Charleston, while commanding a militia force, Heyward was himself taken prisoner. Only hours after being arrested, he and 28 other ringleaders of the rebellion were sent to a guard ship in the harbor. Then they were transported to Florida, and they remained there for about 11 months until they were freed in a prisoner exchange. While in that prison, Heyward transposed a popular English song, God Save the King, into God Save the 13 States. His imprisonment by the British in Florida, having lasted for nearly a year, along with the loss of many of his slaves, led to Heyward being hailed as a martyr of the Revolution. At one time, the Heyward family had the largest holding of slaves in the United States, but the British had confiscated all of Heyward's slaves, and although he later reclaimed some of them, 130 others were permanently transported to the harsh sugar plantations of Jamaica. After the war, Heyward continued to serve as a judge, retiring in 1798. He was married twice, and both of his wives were named Elizabeth. His first wife died in childbirth in Philadelphia, where she had gone to be with Heyward after his release as a prisoner of war. They had 6 children, but only one survived. He had 3 more children with his second wife. Notable descendants of Heyward include Dubois Heyward, whose novel Porgy was transformed by George Gershwin into the American opera Porgy and Bess, which is considered a musical masterpiece. Heyward also had another child by one of his slaves, making him the grandfather of Thomas E. Miller, who was one of only 5 black men that were elected to Congress from the South in the 1890s. Thomas Lynch, Jr. also signed for South Carolina. He was the youngest signer of the Declaration at just 26 years old. The Lynch family were expelled from Ireland following their defeat in the Irish Wars. Lynch Sr. had immigrated from England to South Carolina and then sent his son back to England for higher education. While there, Lynch Jr. received honors at Eton College and at Cambridge. His father encouraged him to remain in London in order to study the law and the principles of the British Constitution, but after 8 years, Lynch Jr. returned to South Carolina. Although his father had dreamed of having his son become a successful lawyer, Lynch Jr. decided not to pursue that profession any further. He enjoyed managing the crops at the family plantation where slave labor was used, but Lynch Jr. still remained active in the political affairs of his community. His father was a member of the Continental Congress, but when he had to step down due to illness, his son was selected to take his place. Lynch Jr. was also elected to a group that penned the South Carolina Constitution. Many people at the time objected to this document, including the Continental Congress. It stood as a temporary constitution because many people hoped that there would eventually be a reconciliation with Great Britain, but that was not to be. So Lynch Jr. became a company commander in the 1st South Carolina Regiment. He then gathered his men and marched to Charleston. On the march, he became so sick that he was prevented from continuing. During his recovery, he received news of his father's declining health, and in the hope that his presence might ease his father's illness, Lynch Jr. asked for permission to leave. That permission was denied, but after he received news of his appointment to his father's seat in the Continental Congress, he was allowed to travel to his father. Although he was still ill, Lynch Jr. traveled to Philadelphia to sign a Declaration of Independence, making Thomas Lynch Sr. and Thomas Lynch Jr. the only father and son to serve successively in the Continental Congress. Less than a month later, Lynch Jr. expressed the feelings of his constituents when he threatened that South Carolina would secede from the United States, quote, "If it is debated whether their slaves are their property, there is an end of the Confederation." Afterwards, an ill Lynch set out for home with his ailing father. On the way to South Carolina, his father suffered a second stroke and died in Annapolis. Lynch Jr. retired to Peachtree Plantation on the South Santee River in early 1777 after suffering for more than 2 years from illness. Friends suggested that he should travel to Europe for his health, so he and his wife sailed for the West Indies on December 17, 1779. His ship disappeared shortly after that, and he and his wife were lost at sea. At the age of 30, Lynch Jr. became both the youngest man to sign the Declaration of Independence and the youngest of the signers to die. At the time of his death, he owned 3 plantations and held more than 250 slaves. Lynch Jr.'s time in Congress lasted less than a year, and for much of that time he was ill, so his autographs are among the rarest of the signers of the Declaration. Only a single letter has survived, along with a few signatures on a few scattered documents. Today, Lynch's autograph sells for as much as $250,000. Arthur Middleton was the final man to sign for South Carolina. He was educated in Britain at Harrow, Westminster, and Cambridge. He studied law and traveled extensively in Europe. He also helped design the Great Seal of South Carolina, in addition to being one of the boldest members of the Council of Safety and its secret committee. Middleton's attitude towards Loyalists was said to be ruthless, in contrast to other South Carolinian patriots, such as Francis Marion, who led the efforts to reconcile with Loyalists after the war had ended. Middleton participated in the defense of Charleston, and afterwards he was sent as a prisoner of war to Florida, along with Edward Rutledge and Thomas Hayward, Jr., until he was exchanged in July of the following year. Middleton died on January 1st, 1787, at the age of 44. His sister, Susanna Middleton, was the great-great-grandmother of Baldur von Schirach, one-time leader of Hitler's youth, who was convicted of crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trials. Not even the Founding Fathers get to choose their relatives. John Hancock signed for Massachusetts, but he affixed his signature by itself in a large, bold hand in the center of the page right under the Declaration. Hancock was a protege of Sam Adams, and after he inherited a mercantile business from his uncle, he also became one of the wealthiest men in the colonies. Hancock decided to use his wealth to support the cause of colonial independence. The British retaliated by seizing his boat and accusing him of smuggling, but they were forced to abandon the charges against him. Paul Revere made his legendary ride to Lexington and Concord to warn them that the British are coming, and to specifically warn Adams and Hancock that the British might arrest them. They both heeded his warning and escaped before the first shots of the war were fired there soon afterwards. After the battle was over, a pardon was offered to all of the patriots who laid down their arms and agreed to submit peacefully. This offer had 2 notable exceptions, John Adams and John Hancock. Hancock's popularity among his peers led to him being elected as president of the Continental Congress. He was also the first and the 3rd governor of Massachusetts. Although, according to John Adams, he was disappointed about losing out to Washington for the position of commander-in-chief of the army, Hancock still continued to admire and support Washington, even after he declined Hancock's request for a military appointment. Hancock's infant daughter died around this same time, and his only other child, a son born 2 years later, died at the age of 9 from a head injury that he suffered while ice skating. John Hancock died in 1793. His funeral was the grandest funeral that had ever been held for any American up until that time, so much so that it was actually declared a state holiday. Maryland. Samuel Chase was the first signer for Maryland. After being nominated by George Washington himself, Chase became an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. In a 73-32 vote, he was impeached by the House of Representatives on the grounds that he had made partial rulings, but Chase was then acquitted in the Senate, who failed to reach the 2/3 majority that was required for them to convict him, so he remained in office. Chase had 9 children and died in 1811 at the age of 70 years old. William Paca likewise signed for the colony of Maryland, and he was also its 3rd governor. Paca's great-great-grandfather had come to America as an indentured servant, but by the next generation his family had become landowners and were so successful that they began to marry into higher society. Paca's father was raised a Quaker, but he left the Friends for the Anglican Church. Unfortunately, many of the details of Paca's life were lost in a fire in 1879, but as his father's 2nd son, he would not have been the heir to his father's estate. Still, his father sought his son's education, and he became a lawyer. Paca married into a prominent family with roots in America that dated all the way back to 1622. He and his friend, Samuel Chase, founded the local chapter of the Sons of Liberty. When Paca's wife died in 1774, he was genuinely grief-stricken, but politics soon distracted him. He served in the First Continental Congress, where he became friends with John Adams. Although he was beloved and respected by all who knew him, Paca did not remarry after his 2nd wife also died. He did, however, father 2 illegitimate daughters, in addition to the 3 children that he had by his 1st wife. Paca was appointed as a federal judge by George Washington, a post in which he continued to serve until his death in 1799. Thomas Stone also signed for the colony of Maryland. He was a pacifist who voted in favor of drafting the Declaration of Independence while still hoping for a diplomatic solution. While working on the committee that was drafting the Articles of Confederation, Stone's visiting wife took a smallpox vaccine because Philadelphia was in the midst of a smallpox epidemic, and she had an adverse reaction to it. So after signing the Articles, Stone took his wife home, where her health continued to decline, and he, in turn, declined any further appointments for a time. Eventually, Stone gave up practicing the law and serving in the state Congress in order to care for his wife and children. His wife, Margaret, died in 1787, and Stone sunk into a deep depression after that, dying himself only 4 months later. Charles Carroll of Carrollton was the final signer for Maryland, and he was the last surviving signer of the Declaration when he eventually died in 1832 at the age of 95 years old. He had added the of Carrollton to his signature in order to distinguish himself from the other Charles Carrolltons in his family so that they couldn't be falsely charged in his place. He was a planter and the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence. Carrollton was known by his contemporaries as the first citizen, and he was also the wealthiest and most formally educated of the signers as a result of his 17-year Jesuit education in France. He spoke 5 languages fluently, and he was thought to be the wealthiest man in all 13 colonies when the war commenced. Carrollton was of Irish descent, English on his mother's side, and he was a powerful voice for the right of the colonies to control their own taxation and for independence. A skilled debater and writer, Carrollton fiercely believed that only war could actually free the colonies. He admitted that slavery was evil, and he supported its gradual abolition, but he did not free his own slaves. He introduced a bill to the Maryland Senate proposing a scheduled abolition of slavery, but it failed to pass. He also worked for an organization that funded returning slaves who had been freed to their home on the shores of Africa, but he was also reportedly the largest single slave owner at the time of the Revolution. Human beings are complicated creatures. Carrollton commissioned the Phoenix Shot Tower in Baltimore, which was the tallest building in the United States until the Washington Monument was built. There are counties named for Carrollton in 13 states, and cities named for him in more than 6 states. Virginia. With 7 men to sign for them, Virginia had the second largest number of delegates in the 13 colonies. George Wythe was the first man from that colony to sign a Declaration of Independence. However, he left the convention to attend to his dying wife before the signing of the Constitution, but later he did help ratify it as well. Wythe was a planter and the grandson of a Quaker He opposed the Stamp Act and other taxes that were imposed by Britain, and he helped design the Seal of Virginia. He served as a judge for most of his life and later as a professor. Wythe was a generous man who left his valuable book collection to his close friend Thomas Jefferson in his will. He had also already emancipated all of his slaves by the time that the American Revolution ended. In fact, during the first 2 decades that followed the end of the war, so many Virginians freed their slaves that free blacks rose from accounting for less than 1% of the population to accounting for nearly 10% of Virginia's population by 1810. That means that 1 person in 10 in the whole state of Virginia was a slave who had been voluntarily freed. As for Wythe, he died of poisoning in 1806. Richard Henry Lee was one of the many famous members of the American Lee family, and he also signed the Declaration on behalf of Virginia. He was best known for the Lee Resolution, the motion in the Second Continental Congress which first called for independence. This resolution is what led to the Declaration of Independence. Lee's resume also included serving as a U.S. Senator and as the 4th President of the Congress of the Confederation, in addition to fathering 13 children, 9 of which survived. Lee abhorred the idea of federal taxes. Thomas Jefferson likewise signed the Declaration on behalf of Virginia. As you know, Jefferson went on to become the 3rd President of the United States, but he was also the 1st Secretary of State under George Washington and the 2nd Vice President under John Adams. He was the 2nd U.S. Minister to France and the 2nd Governor of Virginia following Patrick Henry. He had 6 children and served as a colonel in the Virginia militia. He was a statesman, a diplomat, a lawyer, an architect, and a crucial founding father. Jefferson was appointed to the Committee of 5, who drafted the Declaration of Independence. This committee was made up of Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, Livingston, and Sherman. The committee wanted John Adams to write the Declaration, but he persuaded them to have Jefferson do it instead. So Jefferson became the primary author of that magnificent document. He was inspired in his task by the works of Locke and Montesquieu, advocating for individual human rights, including the freedom of speech, thought, and religion. Jefferson also refuted the idea that the American Indians were inferior, maintaining that they were the equals in body and mind to Europeans. During the war, Jefferson barely escaped Richmond ahead of Benedict Arnold's invasion, but he went on to co-found the Democratic Republican Party, who opposed the Federalists. Then, as president, Jefferson expanded America, doubling its size with the Louisiana Purchase. He also supported the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson had to overcome many personal tragedies in his life. He inherited the responsibilities of Monticello when he was just 13 years old. His beloved wife died within months of giving birth to their last child after eliciting a promise from him that he would never remarry because she did not want their children to be raised by a stepmother as she had been. Jefferson was overcome with grief after her passing, pacing and riding in seclusion for weeks after that. Still, he chose to give his life purpose, and he went on to found the University of Virginia before dying on the 50th anniversary of the signing of his declaration, after noting that this is the 4th. A few hours later, John Adams also died, saying, "Thomas Jefferson survives," apparently comforted by that thought and unaware that Jefferson had already passed away. A gold locket was found around Thomas Jefferson's neck containing a blue ribbon that was tied around the lock of his wife's hair. Jefferson had died deeply in debt, but he made sure in his will to free Sally Hemings' children, who may have also been his. Jefferson was deeply concerned in his final years with the idea that the people needed to understand the principles in the Declaration of Independence. It was his authorship of that document that he had inscribed on his tombstone, not his position as President of the United States. I don't defend Jefferson's decision to own slaves, nor do I think that we should fail to make mention of that. But as I have argued repeatedly in the past, only the people who have contributed as much good to the world as he did while also succeeding in doing less harm to fewer people than he did, are in any way in a position to sit on judgment on him. And that means pretty much no one. Benjamin Harrison also signed for Virginia. He was the son of a tobacco plantation where the first Thanksgiving had been held on December 4th, 1619. Harrison was later sent to William and Mary College, where he met Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. When his father and two of his sisters were killed by a lightning strike, Harrison was forced to return home early to begin managing the family plantation. He married his second cousin, a niece of George Washington's, and they had 8 surviving children, one of which was President William Henry Harrison. A great-grandson of theirs, Civil War General Benjamin Harrison, also went on to become president. At the First Continental Congress, he roomed with George Washington. He was a vehement opposer of the Stamp Act, but Harrison also opposed Patrick Henry's call for civil disobedience. He remained in Congress until 1778 and was well liked for his sense of humor, despite his strong state prejudices, so much so that he was chosen to introduce his fellow delegate, Richard Henry Lee, when he introduced the Ree Resolution calling for independence. Harrison was also chosen to officially read the Declaration of Independence to his fellow delegates on July 2nd, before it was voted on. On August 2nd, while preparing to sign it, Harrison displayed his usual sense of humor when Elbridge Gerry cut in front of him. He quipped, "I shall have a great advantage over you, Mr. Gerry, when we are all hung for what we are now doing. From the size and weight of my body," he was 6'4" and 250 pounds, "I shall die within a few minutes and be with the angels. But from the lightness of your body, you will dance in the air for an hour or two before you are dead." Harrison's family portraits were unfortunately lost when Benedict Arnold ordered them all to be burned during his looting of the area. After the war, Harrison remained active in state politics, following his second cousin, Thomas Nelson Jr., to serve as governor 3 times. He also helped shape the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which he fought to include as a part of the Constitution. Harrison died in 1791 of gout. The next signer for Virginia was Thomas Nelson Jr., who helped his father run several plantations where they owned and worked slaves. He fought as a brigadier general during the siege of Yorktown, the final battle of the war. Cornwallis retreated after the Battle of Yorktown to Nelson's own home, Nelson House, and Nelson encouraged George Washington to burn it down with Cornwallis inside it. Washington was actually Nelson's 3rd cousin, although they may not have known that they were related. Nelson eventually replaced Jefferson as the governor of Virginia. He died 9 days after his 50th birthday, and Nelson County, in both Virginia and in Kentucky, were named after him. Francis Lightfoot Lee signed for Virginia along with his older brother Richard, who we already covered. He was a protester who owned a tobacco plantation, and he too owned slaves, as did 41 of the 56 signers. Francis was yet another member of the prominent Lee family dynasty of Virginia, and he eventually died of pleurisy only 4 days after his wife, 20 years after he signed the Declaration of Independence. Carter Braxton was the final signer for Virginia, and he had the most children out of all of the signers. He had 2 children with his first wife, Judith, who died in childbirth, and 16 more with his second wife, Elizabeth. He was a merchant, a planter, and one of the wealthiest landowners and slave owners in Virginia. Braxton's mother died shortly after his birth, and he inherited his grandfather's estate after his older brother also died. He served as a sheriff and then as a colonel in the local militia. He also helped negotiate alongside his father-in-law and fellow legislator, Patrick Henry, in order to avoid crisis after the colony's gunpowder and the flintlocks for their rifles were seized. Braxton was a moderate as far as revolutionaries go, but he invested a great deal of his personal wealth in the Revolution. His descendants followed his patriotic example and served as officers in America's future wars, as well as in Congress. Braxton died after suffering several strokes. General Braxton Braggs was named for him, after whom the famous Fort Braggs was named, until it was renamed for Roland Braggs, a hero of World War II's Battle of the Bulge. Pennsylvania. With 9 signers, Pennsylvania holds the top spot among the 13 colonies for having the most men sign the Declaration on their behalf. Robert Morris was the first man to sign for Pennsylvania. He was known as the financier of the Revolution, and he also helped to found our financial system. Morris was born in Liverpool, and he immigrated to the colonies at the age of 13. Once here, he became a merchant. His shipping company transported both indentured servants and slaves. He had 7 children with his wife and 1 illegitimate daughter, whom he financially supported. He also supported his own illegitimate half-brother. During the American Revolution, amid rampant inflation, Morris was made superintendent of finance by Congress. With his new authority, he instituted a variety of changes in order to boost the economy. Even so, the soldiers in the Continental Army often went without pay, and he eventually resigned his position in 1784. But Morris continued to fight for the cause that he believed in, eventually becoming a senator. The Napoleonic Wars ruined the markets for America, causing a financial panic which left Morris land rich but cash poor, and he went bankrupt. Unable to pay his debts, he went to debtor's prison for 3.5 years. Morris was released in 1801 and died 5 years later in 1806. He was described as a fallen angel who almost single-handedly financed the final years of the Revolution. Benjamin Rush also signed for the colony of Pennsylvania. His resume included practicing as a physician, a politician, a reformer, a humanitarian, an educator, and he was also the founder of Dickinson College. He became a professor at the University of Pennsylvania after serving as Surgeon General for the Continental Army. On January 11, 1776, he married Julia Stockton, the daughter of a fellow signer. They had 13 children together, 9 of which survived. One of their sons, Richard, would go on to serve in the cabinets of no less than 6 different presidents. Rush was a prominent advocate for many reforms, especially when it came to medicine and education. He opposed slavery and advocated for free speech in schools, the education of women, and reforms to the penal system. His studies on mental disorders contributed so much to our understanding of these conditions that he is considered to be the father of American psychiatry. Rush was a graduate of the school that would eventually become Princeton University. He actively participated in the Sons of Liberty, but ended up causing a controversy when he criticized George Washington by saying that it was only by God's grace that the war had not been lost by him and his weak counselors. After the war, Rush continued to guide the nation, saying, "The American war is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of the great drama is closed." After the war, he continued practicing medicine while teaching medical theory at the University of Pennsylvania, where he instructed the future president, William Henry Harrison. Rush came down with yellow fever during the epidemic of 1793, but he survived. He became an abolitionist, as well as an activist who opposed public punishments, like putting people in the stocks, which was widely accepted at the time. He also opposed capital punishment for all crimes except for first-degree murder. He even argued in favor of temperance. Rush educated over 3,000 medical students, and he helped to reconcile Jefferson and Adams before they died. Rush himself eventually died of typhus fever in 1813, and he is buried not far from Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin likewise signed for Pennsylvania at the advanced age of 70 years old. He was in fact the oldest man to sign the Declaration of Independence. Franklin's is a hard life to try and summarize in just a few minutes, so I'll do my best to give you even the highlights of the highlights. Ben Franklin was born on January 11th, 1706 in Boston. He was his father's 15th child and the youngest son. At the age of 17, Ben ran away to Philadelphia for a new start. He eventually invented the first newspaper chain, which stretched from New England to the Carolinas. He also sponsored over 24 other printers in other colonies and as far away as the Caribbean. After his second editor died, Franklin allowed his editor's widow to take over, making her one of the first female printers in America. Theirs was a business relationship that continued to prosper for more than 3 decades. At the age of 17, Ben proposed to Deborah Reed, whose mother would not allow them to marry. While Ben was away in London, Deborah's mother urged her to marry John Rogers, who took her dowry and fled to Barbados in order to avoid prosecution for his debts. Bigamy laws prevented Deborah from remarrying another man while the fate of her husband was unknown. Undeterred, Franklin resumed his courtship of her when he returned home, and they began a common-law marriage in 1730. Together they raised his acknowledged illegitimate son along with 2 children of their own. Their son died of smallpox at the age of 4, but their daughter survived. Ben's wife died of a stroke in 1774 while he was away on a diplomatic mission to Great Britain. His illegitimate son, William, served as the last royal governor of New Jersey, and as a devout loyalist to the king, he fell out with his father. He was eventually arrested, but he refused to stop trying to sway Americans to the loyalist cause. He was eventually imprisoned in solitary confinement before being released in a prisoner exchange. He then sailed to England, never to return. His father had been awarded an honorary Master of Arts at Harvard, Yale, and the College of William and Mary in the 1750s. He was also awarded an honorary doctorate by Oxford in 1760 for his scientific work. He was a member of the Committee of Five, which was commissioned to draft the Declaration of Independence, where he made a few small edits to Jefferson's work. Ben went down in history as the author of many poignant proverbs, but he is perhaps most famous for responding to John Hancock's assertion that they must all hang together by responding, "Yes, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Franklin famously proved that lightning consists of electricity. He also invented bifocal glasses, catheters, lightning rods, daylight savings time, and he published Poor Richard's Almanac. Franklin was the 6th President of Pennsylvania, the 1st Postmaster General of the United States, the U.S. Minister to Sweden, the U.S. Minister to France, and the 1st President of the University of Pennsylvania. A true Renaissance man, Ben was a writer, a scientist, an inventor, a statesman, a diplomat, a printer, a publisher, and a political philosopher. He played 3 musical instruments, studied oceanography, composed music, and was an avid chess player. He was the Grand Master of his Masonic Lodge, and he remained a Freemason throughout his lifetime. Franklin was also a major player in fostering a positive relationship between America and France, which became vital in securing the French alliance during the Revolution. Later, Franklin advocated for tolerance of religion in France while he was our ambassador there, and he contributed to the Edict of Versailles. Earlier in his life, Franklin had owned 7 slaves, but by 1750, a full quarter of a century before signing the Declaration, he had become an abolitionist who was promoting both education and integration for African Americans. He charted and named the Gulf Stream Current. He funded Philadelphia's first fire department and the University of Pennsylvania. Benjamin Franklin absolutely earned his title as the first American. He was foundational in defining America's ethos. His more than 30,000 letters and documents have been in high demand, being collected and reprinted from his own lifetime onwards. In poor health from several conditions resulting from his obesity, Ben was rarely seen in public after signing the Declaration. He died in his home in April of 1790. 20,000 people attended his funeral. At the age of 22, Franklin had written what he hoped would be his own epitaph. It read, "The body of B. Franklin, printer. Like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out, and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author." John Morton, another of Pennsylvania's many signers, was a farmer, surveyor, and jurist. He provided the swing vote that allowed Pennsylvania to vote in favor of the Declaration of Independence, and he chaired the committee that wrote the Articles of Confederation, although he died before signing it. Morton was the first signer of the Declaration to die, only 9 short months after that. George Clymer was one of only 6 founders who signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. He was one of the first advocates for complete independence. He was a slave owner for a short time, briefly owning one man when he inherited him at the age of 7 years old. He fought unsuccessfully in Congress to restrict the importing of slaves, but he continued to serve there until his death. Of his many children, 4 died in infancy, and his son, John Meredith, died at the age of 18 in the Whiskey Rebellion of 1787. Clymer followed in 1813. James Smith, another signer for Pennsylvania, was born in Ireland, and he immigrated to the New World at the age of 10. He studied law and became a captain in his local militia. Smith was re-elected to Congress in 1785, but he declined because of his advanced age. He died in 1806. George Taylor also signed for Pennsylvania, and he too was born in Ireland. He emigrated at the age of 20, indenturing himself in order to pay for his passage. He started his new life in America as a laborer in the ironworks, but when it was made known that he had been educated, he was promoted from ironmaster to clerk. He served as a justice of the peace, and he even helped to build his local county courthouse. After failing to convince the First Continental Congress to break with Britain, Taylor resigned and refused to return to attend the second session. He was then re-elected to the Assembly in 1775, where he began helping the colonial forces prepare for what he knew was coming. To this end, he was commissioned as a colonel in the 3rd Battalion of the Pennsylvania Militia. Congress voted for independence on July 2nd and signed a declaration on July 4th, after which all Loyalists were forced to resign. Taylor was among the 20 replacements who were appointed by the Assembly. One of the first duties of his new job was to sign the Declaration of Independence, which he did on August 2nd, along with most of the delegates who signed it. Of the 56 men to sign, Taylor was one of only 8 who were born in foreign lands, and he was the only signer to have ever been indentured. Taylor served in Congress for only 7 months until Pennsylvania could appoint a new delegate, but he continued to serve in the Revolution by overseeing cannon shot and shell productions for the Continental Army and the Navy. His wife was raised a Quaker, but she was disavowed by the group for marrying outside of the faith. Taylor and his wife had 2 children. Their daughter died, but their son survived. George Taylor died in 1781 at the age of 65. He named his eldest grandchild as his heir and left £500 to his housekeeper, quote, in consideration for great care and attendance on me for a number of years, along with some inheritance for the 5 children that they had had together. But his estate was ultimately declared insolvent. James Wilson, who likewise signed for Pennsylvania, was born in Scotland, and he immigrated to America when he was 24 years old. He married twice and had 7 children. Wilson had studied at the University of St. Andrews, the University of Glasgow, and the University of Edinburgh, and he became one of only 6 people who signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. During the Revolution, he rose to the rank of Brigadier General in the militia, and he served on the Committee of Spies with Jefferson, Adams, Rutledge, and Livingston. Although Wilson did own a household slave, he also argued against the idea of slavery, but he remained mostly quiet on the issue so as not to alienate the pro-slavery delegates into refusing to sign the Declaration of Independence. However, his beliefs were reflected in his penning of the 3/5 Compromise, which counted 3/5 of each state's slave population towards its representation. This at least laid the foundation for recognizing slaves as part of this country. Wilson is also credited with adding the word "we" to the phrase "we the people." His speech during the debates about ratifying the Constitution was even more influential than the Federalist Papers were at the time, and copies were distributed by Washington himself. Scholars consider his work to be on par with Jefferson's and Adams'. Wilson also served as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, a position to which he was appointed by George Washington. He was, in fact, one of the first 4 judges that Washington appointed. Wilson also became the first professor of law at what would become the University of Pennsylvania, and he taught his first course on the new Constitution, which he taught directly to George Washington and his cabinet. This made sense because Wilson was the principal architect of the executive branch of the federal government. He wanted a single chief executive rather than having a group of people that would be in charge of that branch, the way that the other 2 branches were set up. Wilson envisioned an executive branch that would be led by a single person that would be active and independent, yet still accountable. This idea was opposed by many people who feared that such a concept would eventually lead to a monarchy, which is why they preferred a governing group at the head of all three branches. But Wilson was an outspoken supporter for our need to have a strong national government and for proportional representation that would be based on population size. So he championed the popularly elected House of Representatives and opposed the idea of the Senate. Unable to prevent its inclusion as a part of Congress, Wilson compromised by advocating for the direct election of all United States senators by the people. He also supported the idea of having a national popular vote to select the president, and he proposed the use of an electoral college, but he opposed the idea of the Bill of Rights. Wilson also argued that the Constitution should be ratified directly by the citizens of each state rather than by their legislatures. He was one of the few major founders to believe in the principle of one man, one vote. But he also advocated for broadening voting rights for more people, as opposed to limiting votes to only property owners. Wilson left Congress in 1777, where he had been the most active and influential delegate when it came to laying down the general outline that governed the relations between Congress and the bordering Indian tribes. A legal scholar and one of the most learned framers of the Constitution, he was also one of the most prominent lawyers of his time. After the Fort Wilson riot, he successfully defended 23 people against attempts to seize their property. However, the Panic of 96 and 97 multiplied Wilson's debts, and he briefly went to debtor's prison. His son paid his debt, and once he was free, Wilson fled to North Carolina in order to avoid other debtors. So he was briefly imprisoned again, but he still continued to fulfill his duties as a federal judge. In 1798, Wilson contracted malaria. Then he died of a stroke at the age of 65. George Ross was the last man to sign for Pennsylvania, and he was also the uncle of Betsy Ross's husband. He studied law and became a member of the Committee of Safety. He also undertook negotiations with the local Indians on behalf of the colonies and became judge of the Admiralty Court of Pennsylvania. However, poor health forced Ross to resign from the Continental Congress in 1777, and he died in 1779 at the age of 49. Delaware. Caesar Rodney was the first man to sign for Delaware. He was also the fourth president of that colony. He served as an officer in the Delaware militia during the French and Indian Wars and in the American Revolution. Rodney also served as a Continental Congressman and as the president of Delaware during most of the American Revolution. His 849-acre farm was worked by slaves, and at the time of Rodney's death he owned 18 people. His will freed 3 of them, and held the others to be freed according to a manumission schedule that he had devised for them. The Rodneys were, by the standards of the day, prosperous members of the local gentry. Caesar was the only one of the Rodney children to receive anything approaching a formal education. His father died in 1746, and he was raised by a guardian who was appointed by Delaware's orphan court. Rodney lived as a bachelor and was generally well esteemed. He had professed his affection for several ladies at different times during his life, but he was never a successful suitor, most likely due to his facial disfigurement. He had easily transitioned into the political world of his father and guardian, after which he was quickly appointed to a series of positions in the realm of public service. Rodney and his brother Thomas increasingly aligned themselves with the Country Party, where they worked in partnership with Thomas McCain against George Read. Rodney served with both of them in the Continental Congress, but he was in Dover tending to Loyalist activities there when he received word from McCain that he and Read were deadlocked on the vote for independence. In order to break the deadlock, Rodney rode 70 miles through a thunderstorm on the night of July 1st, 1776, arriving in Philadelphia in his boots and spurs on July 2nd, just as the voting began. He then signed the Declaration on August 2nd. Upon learning of the death of his friend, John Haslet, in the Battle of Princeton, Rodney rushed to fill his place in the Continental Army. However, General George Washington returned Rodney home so that he could serve as Delaware's wartime governor, and the Major General of the Delaware Militia. Via his distant Italian heritage, one source has identified Rodney as the first Italian-American governor of a U.S. state. However, his health was worsening, and he resigned his office on November 6, 1781, just after the decisive Battle of Yorktown. Still, Rodney was elected to the 1783-84 session of the Legislative Council, and as a final gesture of respect, the council selected him to be their speaker. His health was now in rapid decline, and even though the Legislative Council met at his home for a short period of time to make things easier on him, Rodney died before the session ended. Rodney had been tormented throughout his life by asthma, and his adult years were plagued by a facial cancer. He underwent expensive, painful, and ultimately useless medical treatments for the cancer, so he was forced to wear a green scarf to hide his disfigured face. He died from the disease after 8 years. His body is buried in an unmarked grave on his beloved farm, Poplar Grove, known today as Byfield. George Read also signed for the colony of Delaware. He was one of only 2 statesmen to sign 4 of the great state papers on which our country's founding is based: Petition to the King, Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution of the United States. Read became his state's 3rd governor, and in 1763 he married the niece of his fellow signer, George Ross. They had 4 children together. The largest party in the colony of Delaware was the Court Party, which opposed the smaller Country Party. It was Anglican and was in favor of reconciliation with Britain. Read was often the leader of this party, and he generally worked in opposition to Caesar Rodney and his friend and neighbor Thomas McKean. Read opposed the Stamp Act, but he supported the idea of economic sanctions and dignified protest. He was quite reluctant to pursue the path of complete independence, and he was frequently absent. However, when the Congress voted on independence on July 2nd, Read was there to vote against it. Still, when the Declaration of Independence was finally adopted, Read put his life on the line by signing it, despite his personal reservations. At the time of the capture of President John McKinley, Read was in Philadelphia attending Congress. After narrowly escaping capture himself while he was returning home, he became the president. He then led the ratification movement of the United States Constitution in Delaware, which, partly as a result of his efforts, became the first state to ratify it, and they did so unanimously. Then Read was elected as one of Delaware's 2 United States senators. However, he resigned in order to accept an appointment as Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, and he served in that capacity until his death. Read died from heart problems in 1798. Thomas McKean was the final man to sign for Delaware. McKean was at various times a member of the Federalists and at other times a member of the Democratic-Republican Party. McKean served as the President of Delaware, as Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, and as the 2nd Governor of Pennsylvania. He also held other public offices, including serving as the 8th President of the Continental Congress. Both of his parents were Irish-born Protestants who came to Pennsylvania as children. Mary Borden was Thomas McKean's first wife. They had 6 children together. Sarah Armitage was his second wife, and they had 4 children. Delaware was split into 2 parties. McKean was part of the smaller Country Party, which was made up largely of Irish Presbyterians, aka Scotch-Irish. They were in favor of independence. In fact, the revolutionary slogan, "No taxation without representation," had originated in the north of Ireland, under laws which denied Presbyterians and Catholics the rights to vote for members of Parliament. McKean quickly became one of the most influential members of the Stamp Act Congress. He disputed so loudly and so long that a challenge to a duel was issued by his opposition, and he accepted that challenge in the presence of Congress. However, his challenger left the next morning at daybreak, so the duel did not take place. McKean was also a key voice in persuading others to vote in favor of the split with Great Britain. After the vote in favor of independence, McKean participated in the debate over the wording of the official declaration. A few days after McCain cast his vote, he left Congress to serve as a colonel in a militia unit that had been created by Benjamin Franklin back in 1747. They joined General George Washington's defense of New York. Being away, McCain was not available when most of the signers placed their signatures on the Declaration on August 2nd. It is assumed that he signed sometime after that, possibly as late as 1781. He was constantly pursued by the British forces, which forced him to relocate his family 5 different times. McCain also had been elected to a special convention to draft a new state constitution, and when he heard about his election, McCain made the long ride to Dover from Philadelphia in a single day. He went straight to a room in the inn, and that night, virtually by himself, he drafted the document. The Delaware Constitution of 1776 became the first state constitution to be produced after the Declaration of Independence. Later, as Chief Justice under a Pennsylvania Constitution that he considered to be flawed, he assumed that it was the right of the court to strike down any legislative acts that it deemed unconstitutional, preceding the United States Supreme Court's establishment of that very doctrine, known as judicial review, by at least 10 years. As Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, McCain also played a role in the Whiskey Rebellion. He took part in the conference on the rebellion with Washington and his cabinet, the governor of Pennsylvania, and other officials. Washington believed the rebellion could mean an end to our Constitution and laws, so he advocated the most spirited and firm measures. But Washington held back on exactly what he meant by that. Alexander Hamilton was more direct, insisting on the propriety of an immediate resort to military force. McCain, in turn, argued that the matter should be left up to the courts, not to the military. McCain eventually died in Philadelphia, and for the record, I'm sorry, but the play 1776 got it wrong. He was not a Scottish immigrant. His parents were Irish Presbyterians, and his surname is pronounced McCain, not McKean. New York. William Floyd was the first man to sign for the colony of New York. He was a wealthy farmer and political leader. A few weeks after the Declaration was signed, the British invaded Long Island. Once there, they confiscated Floyd's house and used it as a base for their cavalry for the next 7 years. During that time, Floyd served as a major general in the state militia and was elected to the first U.S. Congress in 1789. He had 6 slaves and 2 free black residents who lived in his household. Floyd was married to Hannah Jones, and they had 3 children, one of which was Mary Floyd, who married Colonel Benjamin Talmadge, who was in charge of President George Washington's spy ring. You may remember his character from the series Turn. After the death of Floyd's first wife in 1781, he remarried Joanna Strong, and they had 2 daughters together. Philip Livingston signed for New York as well. He was a merchant, a politician, and a slave trader who favored economic sanctions as the best way to pressure Parliament into repealing the intolerable acts. Livingston graduated from Yale and began an apprenticeship under his father. He also speculated heavily in real estate and in the slave trade, financing at least 15 slave trading voyages, which transported hundreds of slaves to New York. In 1754, Livingston negotiated with the Indians during the French and Indian War. Later, he became an active promoter of efforts to raise and fund troops for the Revolution. His brother William, who was a prominent lawyer in New Jersey, was also a delegate to the Continental Congress from 1774 to 1776. While the British were occupying New York City, Livingston and his family fled to another home. During this time, his abandoned slaves may have sought their freedom from the British, who offered freedom to any black American who was willing to join them. After the Battle of Long Island, General George Washington and his officers met at Livingston's residence, and there they decided to evacuate. The British then used Livingston's home as barracks, and his second home as a Royal Navy hospital. Livingston had 9 children, including John Abraham Livingston, who served as a commissary to the Continental Army during the war, before dying in Charleston. Another son, Henry Philip Livingston, was a captain in General Washington's Life Guard. Livingston himself suffered from dropsy, and his health soon deteriorated. He died suddenly while attending the 6th session of Congress in Pennsylvania. By that time, his estate was insufficient to meet his debts. Francis Lewis also signed for the colony of New York. He was born in Wales and worked in a mercantile house in London until he turned 21, when he inherited some properties that had been left for him by his father. Lewis sold the properties and used the proceeds to acquire merchandise. Then he set sail for New York City, arriving there as a merchant in 1734 or 1735. He made several transatlantic trips after that and was even taken prisoner while serving as a British mercantile agent, after which he was sent to France for imprisonment. Upon his release, he became active in politics. In 1745, Lewis married Elizabeth Annesley, and together they were the parents of 7 children, 3 of whom survived. His son Morgan served in the Continental Army during the Revolution, and he later held many offices, including governor. Lewis relocated his family to present-day Queens, but their home was later destroyed by the British soldiers, who arrested his wife and even denied her a change of clothing or adequate food for the weeks that followed. Her hardships in captivity ruined her health and eventually led to her death in 1778, after she had been released in a prisoner exchange. Francis Lewis then died in 1802. Lewis Morris was the final signer for New York. He was a landowner and developer. Morris was born in 1726 in what is now part of Bronx County. He graduated from Yale and eventually inherited his father's estate. When he came of age, Morris expanded the estate and married. He went on to serve as the 8th governor of New Jersey, and he championed land ownership for more people. In fact, Morristown, New Jersey, was named for him. As the Revolution drew near, Morris resigned from the Admiralty Court where he was serving. When he was warned by his brother, Stats Morris, who was a general in the British Army, about the consequences that might follow if he were to actually sign the rebellious document known as the Declaration of Independence, Morris replied, "Damn the consequences, give me the pen," and he signed the Declaration. Morris's 3 oldest sons went on to have distinguished military careers during the Revolution. Although he had been widowed, Morris had remarried, and they had 10 children, including Colonel Lewis V. Morris, General Jacob Morris, New York is named for him, Lieutenant William Walton Morris, and Captain Richard Valentine Morris. After the war, Morris had to rebuild his family estate, which had been looted and burned by the British. In 1790, he generously offered the land as the site for the U.S. Capitol. Morris died on his estate, and he was buried in the family vault. He is the great-grandfather of Lewis Morris Rutherford, a pioneering astrophotographer who took the first telescopic photographs of the moon and the sun. New Jersey. Richard Stockton was the first man to sign for New Jersey. He was a lawyer, a jurist, and a legislator. His father had donated the land that became Princeton University. Stockton's wife, Annis Boudinot Stockton, was a poet, and her brother Elias was a statesman who married Stockton's sister Hannah. Stockton was a longtime friend of George Washington's, as well as the father of 6 children. His son became a prominent lawyer and Federalist leader, while he became the president of the college that would become known as Princeton University, thanks to fellow signer John Witherspoon. Stockton and George Clymer were sent by Congress to Ticonderoga, and on his way home, Stockton stopped to warn a friend that his family should evacuate. While there, he and his friend were captured and drugged from their beds in the middle of the night by Loyalists. They were stripped of their property and marched to the fort, where they were turned over to the British. Stockton was placed in irons before he finally accepted a pardon on the condition of his future peaceful obedience to the king. Then he was moved to Provost Prison and eventually paroled after suffering severely failing health from his ill treatment there. His plight caused Congress to empower George Washington to make inquiries into his treatment, and he was paroled soon after those questions were asked. Stockton had given his word and signed a document vowing that he would not meddle any further in the Revolution, but he refused to sign a document that renounced the cause of independence. He gave his oath of allegiance to the United States, but because of his oath to meddle no further in the war, Stockton was forced to resign from Congress. He was never free from pain after his imprisonment until the day he died in February of 1781. His grandson was a hero of the War of 1812 and later became a senator. John Witherspoon also signed for New Jersey. He was a Presbyterian minister, a farmer, and a slave owner. He eventually became the 6th president of Princeton University. He was the only active clergyman and the only president of a college to sign the Declaration of Independence. Born in Scotland, Witherspoon obtained a Master of Arts from the University of Edinburgh, where he remained to study divinity. He was awarded an honorary doctorate in divinity from the University of St. Andrews 25 years later. As a staunch supporter of Protestantism, nationalism, and republicanism, Witherspoon opposed the Jacobite uprising of 45-46, with which the fans of Outlander will be familiar. After the Jacobite victory at Falkirk, Witherspoon was briefly imprisoned, which had long-term effects on his health. He fathered 10 children, 5 of which survived. Having turned down Benjamin Rush and Richard Stockton once already, Witherspoon finally accepted the position of head professor at a small Presbyterian college in New Jersey, which would eventually become known as Princeton University. Witherspoon and his family immigrated in 1768 when he was 45 years old. The school was in a very bad way, both financially and institutionally, and Witherspoon immediately began fundraising. He also donated 300 volumes of his own valuable books to the scanty library. He then went on to purchase scientific equipment and maps. He overhauled the syllabus and restructured the school after the Scottish universities. Witherspoon also stiffened the entrance requirements in order to place Princeton in a position where it could compete with Harvard and Yale. He personally taught courses on history, divinity, and philosophy, and he was very popular with both faculty and his students. Students that benefited from Witherspoon's transformation of the school included future leaders of the nation, Aaron Burr, James Madison, and William Bradford, as well as 37 judges, including 1 Supreme Court justice, 10 cabinet officers, 12 members of the Continental Congress, 28 senators, and 49 congressmen. Despite this, there have been petitions to remove his statue from Princeton University because of his connections to slavery, and I don't think I really need to voice my obvious opinion about that particular cause. Witherspoon served in Congress as one of its most influential members until 1784, during which time he served on more than 100 committees. As the British approached, he closed and evacuated the college. Later, he rebuilt parts of the damaged school at his own expense, putting him in great financial difficulty. At the age of 68, Witherspoon remarried and had 2 more children. He suffered an eye injury and was blind by 1792. He died 2 years later. An inventory of his property showed that he owned 2 slaves at the time. His oldest son, James, a Princeton graduate, was killed in the Battle of Germantown in 1777 while fighting for the Continental Army. Witherspoon's second son, John, also a Princeton graduate, was lost at sea in 1795. Witherspoon had argued against the abolition of slavery, but he also argued for the humane treatment of slaves and for gradual emancipation. But I am sure that his critics are justified in their firm belief that they are his moral superiors when it comes to contributing to the good of mankind. Francis Hopkinson signed for the colony of New Jersey as well. He was a lawyer, an accomplished poet, a satirist, harpsichordist, and a composer. His song, My Days Have Been So Wondrous Free, took a poem by Thomas Parnell and set it to music, making it the first known non-religious song by a composer who was born in America. Hopkinson was appointed by George Washington as a federal judge. Then he was impeached, but he was later acquitted. He also designed continental paper money and 2 early versions of our flag, one for the United States and one for the United States Navy. Hopkinson served in the Second Continental Congress and as a member of the Navy Board. He designed the Great Seal of New Jersey and was chosen as one of 3 consultants that were authorized to work on the Great Seal of the United States, which can be seen on the reverse of the $1 bill. Hopkinson's design of an unfinished pyramid with a radiant eye, which he designed for the $50 bill, was used by Barton as the Great Seal's reverse. On June 14, 1777, thereafter celebrated as Flag Day, The Continental Marine Committee prompted the Second Continental Congress to officially adopt the Stars and Stripes, making Hopkinson the designer of our beloved flag. He was the father of 5 children, one of which served as a representative in Congress, and he also became a federal judge. Hopkinson died in May of 1791 of an apoplexy or stroke. John Hart likewise signed for New Jersey, and he was the father of 10 children. His wife died in October of 1776, shortly after he signed the Declaration of Independence. Hart became a judge, and in that capacity he was known as Honest John. Hart also served as treasurer of the Council of Safety, where he was authorized to handle affairs in a state of emergency. When the British reached his home county, he was obliged to flee, and he lived in hiding for a time. When the Continentals captured Trenton, Hart was allowed to return home. Then he offered to house George Washington and the entire Continental Army camp on his farm. So for 3 days he hosted 12,000 men, including George Washington, who dined with him. In November of 1778, Hart went to Hopewell. 2 days later, he reported that he was too ill with kidney stones to return for the assembly. He lingered in pain for 6 months and died in May of 1779 at the age of 65, not living to see the end of the war. Congressman John Hart Brewer and former House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer are both descendants of his. Abraham Clark was the final man to sign for New Jersey. He was a congressman in the 2nd and 3rd Congress. He also worked as a surveyor while he taught himself the law. Then he went into practice, where he became known as the poor man's counselor for defending people who could not afford a lawyer. Clark was also a slave owner. He had 10 children, and he died of sunstroke in 1794. New Hampshire. Josiah Bartlett was one of 3 men who signed for the colony of New Hampshire. His was a distinguished family that dated back to William the Conqueror. Bartlett even had relatives that fought at Agincourt. How cool is that? His family tree included members of Parliament as well, but Bartlett struck out on his own to practice medicine, and he gained recognition during a diphtheria epidemic, during which he saved the lives of many of his patients, including his own children. He married a cousin, and they had 12 children together, 8 of which lived. Bartlett was the first man to vote for and the second man to sign the Declaration of Independence. He also fought in the Revolution and was wounded while fighting for his country. Later he went on to become the Chief Justice of New Hampshire's Supreme Court. Then he served in office as their governor. Bartlett died in 1795. William Whipple also signed for New Hampshire. He was a ship captain and a merchant who studied to become a judge before dying at the age of 55. He was the cousin of his fellow signers, Stephen Hopkins. Whipple also served as a brigadier general in the Continental Army as part of the New Hampshire militia. He fought at the Battle of Saratoga of Benedict Arnold lore, where he served with distinction. He fought at Burness Heights, Bennington, and the Battle of Rhode Island. A promising young man, Whipple made shipmaster by the age of 21. He earned his fortune at sea trading wood, rum, and slaves. But he freed his own slaves, saying that one could not fight for freedom while holding another man in bondage. He wrote, "A recommendation has gone thither for raising some regiments of blacks. This, I suppose, will lay the foundation for the emancipation of those wretches in that country. I hope it will be the means of dispensing the blessings of freedom to all the human race in America." Matthew Thornton was the 3rd delegate to sign for New Hampshire, but he didn't sign with his fellow representatives. His name appears last on the Declaration of Independence, so we will return to him in a moment. Massachusetts. Samuel Adams was the first of 5 men to sign for the colony of Massachusetts. He was the second cousin of John Adams, and he played a major role in helping to stir up the people in the colonies into launching into a revolution. Samuel Adams was especially gifted at doing this by using the colonial newspapers. He also helped devise the correspondence system that was used to coordinate the resistance across the 13 colonies. It is likely that Sam Adams was involved in the Boston Tea Party, although he eventually went on to more respectable roles when he became the governor of Massachusetts, after helping to write the state's constitution. Sam was once considered to be even more famous than his cousin John. John Adams signed just below his rebel cousin. He went on to serve as the first vice president under George Washington. He then served 2 terms as the second president of the United States, just like Washington had done before him. Adams was also the father of our 6th president, John Quincy Adams. Adams and his son are the only 2 presidents among the first 12 who never owned slaves. Additionally, Adams helped Jefferson, who served as his vice president, to write the Declaration of Independence. His writings heavily influenced the Constitution as well. He was committed to the presumption of innocence by any court of law, and he successfully defended British soldiers at trial as their attorney after the Boston Massacre. John Adams died when he was 90 years old, only a few hours after Jefferson died, making him the longest-lived president until Ronald Reagan eventually surpassed him. Robert Treat Paine was the 3rd delegate for Massachusetts. He was also the first Attorney General for that state. He is supposed to be descended from William the Conqueror, Alfred the Great, Charlemagne, and an original signer of the Magna Carta. Paine entered Harvard at the age of 14, but he was left to make his own way in the world when his father lost his fortune. Paine was close friends with the Franklins and a rival of John Adams. They squared off after the Boston Massacre, with Paine prosecuting and Adams defending the British soldiers. Although he failed to convict, this trial put Paine on the map. But even as a part of the Second Continental Congress, Paine was hesitant to fully separate from England. Even after the battles of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, he still hoped for peace. So he also signed the Olive Branch Petition. After the king rejected that petition, all hope was lost, and war became inevitable. After the war, Paine helped to draft the state constitution on which the United States Constitution and others around the world were modeled. Paine enjoyed a peaceful retirement and died in 1814. Elbridge Gerry also signed for the colony of Massachusetts, and he went on to become the 5th Vice President of the United States under James Madison. Gerrymandering, or moving the borders of an electoral district in order to create an advantage for one party or the other, is named after him. In 1787, Gerry refused to sign the Constitution because at that time it had no Bill of Rights attached to it. So, as a United States Congressman, he helped to draft one for us. Gerry was a strong advocate for states' rights and individual liberties. He was also an advocate of and fought for a limited central government and a civilian-controlled military. Gerry resigned from the Continental Congress over what he saw as federal overreach of power. Eventually, he became the governor of Massachusetts after having lost a previous race. At 68, Gerry was the oldest person to become vice president, a record that he held until 1929, but he only served for 21 months. Gerry died in office and is the only signer of the Declaration who is buried in Washington, D.C. Rhode Island. Stephen Hopkins was the first man to sign for Rhode Island. He also went on to become Chief Justice of the Rhode Island Supreme Court, as well as serving as the governor of the colony of Rhode Island 4 times. A serious student of science, math, and literature from his childhood, Hopkins eventually became a surveyor and an astronomer. He began his life of public service at the age of 23 when he became Justice of the Peace. Then he became a judge while owning a foundry and working as a merchant. Hopkins had many bitter debates with Samuel Ward over the use of paper currency, and theirs was a rivalry that eventually degenerated into lawsuits. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed. This act was a thinly veiled scheme designed to increase taxes on the colonies. The act stated that all commercial and legal documents must be written on stamped paper, which was sold by government officials. And it also put a tax on newspapers, sugar, coffee, and other goods, while requiring that local lumber and iron from the colonies could only be exported to England, thus cutting out all of the other buyers' competition. The news of these abuses of power infuriated Americans and caused Samuel Adams to invite all of the colonies to a Congress of Delegates in New York. Hopkins wrote a pamphlet called The Rights of Colonies Examined. It begins, "Liberty is the greatest blessing that men enjoy, and slavery the heaviest curse that human nature is capable of." It went on to present a clear and rational examination of the relationship between the American colonies and England. At 68, Hopkins was one of the most senior signers of the Declaration, but he still had the fighting spirit when he told his fellow delegates, "Powder and ball will decide this question. The gun and bayonet alone will finish the contest in which we are engaged, and any of you who cannot bring your minds to this mode of adjusting the quarrel had better retire in time." By 1776, Hopkins had severe palsy in his hands. In order to even sign the Declaration of Independence, he was forced to hold his right hand with his left while saying, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not." Failing health eventually forced Hopkins to resign from the Continental Congress. Hopkins owned 7 slaves, which was enough to put him in the top 5% of slave owners in his state. And although he was a slave owner, like the vast majority of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were, Hopkins specifically mentioned 5 of his slaves in his will. They were bequeathed to close family members with instructions for their care, which was extremely unusual for any slave owner to do at the time. The woman was to go to his wife Anne and be treated, quote, "so that servitude may not be a burden to her." The man was to go to his oldest son and be treated, quote, "so that his life may be rendered easy and comfortable." The will was never enacted because Hopkins ended up living another 25 years and circumstances changed. In 1772, Hopkins freed the man originally bequeathed to his son and wrote the following in the manumission document. "But principally, and most of all, finding that the merciful and beneficent goodness of Almighty God, by the blessed gospel of Jesus Christ our Lord, hath by the blessed Spirit taught all who honestly obey its divine dictates, that the keeping of any of his rational creatures in bondage, who are capable of taking care of and providing for themselves in a state of freedom, is altogether inconsistent with his holy and righteous will." Hopkins felt that the bondage of self-sufficient, rational creatures went against God's will, but he also thought that unconditional freedom for slaves who could not provide for themselves would be irresponsible on his part. To this end, he refused to free his female slave, Phoebo, even though it cost him his membership in the Quakers. His rationale was that, quote, "she has children that need the immediate care of a mother." It appears that the 3 slaves that remained with Hopkins were not freed until after his death, but at least 2 of them had been living semi-independently for several years before he died. Hopkins furthermore introduced a bill in 1774 in Rhode Island which barred importing more slaves. This became one of the first anti-slavery laws in the United States. Hopkins died in 1785 at the age of 78. William Ellery also signed for Rhode Island, and he was a descendant of Thomas Cornell. Ellery was educated by his father, and he went on to become a Harvard graduate. At Harvard, he excelled at Greek and Latin, and then he began practicing law. Ellery also became active with the Sons of Liberty. He was, in fact, a last-minute replacement in 1776 after Samuel Ward died. That is how he ended up signing the Declaration of Independence. Ellery's signature is second in size only to John Hancock's. He eventually became Chief Justice for the Supreme Court of Rhode Island, and he was an abolitionist from 1785 on. He was married twice and had 19 children, along with many prominent descendants. Ellery died in 1820 at the age of 92. The Sons of the Revolution and the Daughters of the American Revolution hold an annual commemoration at his gravesite on each anniversary of Independence Day. Connecticut. Roger Sherman was the first man to sign for the colony of Connecticut. His education did not extend beyond grammar school and his father's extensive library. His early career was spent as a shoemaker. However, Sherman had an aptitude for learning and access to his father's library, and there was also a Harvard-educated minister, Reverend Samuel Dunbar, who took Sherman under his wing. In partnership with his brother William, Sherman opened the town's first store, a cobbler shop, and he worked as a county surveyor in 1745. During this time, Sherman also studied the law on his own, passing the bar in 1754. He very quickly became involved in politics, rapidly becoming one of the town's leading citizens and the town clerk. In 1759, Sherman then began providing astronomical calculations for almanacs. Sherman was married 2 times, and he had a total of 15 children, 13 of which lived to adulthood. He was awarded an honorary Master of Arts degree, and he also worked as a professor of religion at Yale for many years. During February of 1776, Sherman, George Wythe, and John Adams were all members of the committee that was responsible for establishing guidelines for U.S. embassy officials in Canada. The committee instructions included, "You are to declare that we hold sacred the rights of conscience, and may promise to the whole peoples solemnly in our name the free and undisturbed exercise of their religion, and that all civil rights and the rights to hold office were to be extended to persons of any Christian denomination." Sherman is the only person to sign all 4 of the great state papers of the United States: the Continental Associations, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the United States Constitution. He also signed the 1774 petition to the king. In addition to establishing a legal career, despite his lack of formal education, Sherman was a member of the Committee of 5 that drafted the Declaration of Independence. Sherman was also a signatory of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, and a member of the Committee of 13 that was responsible for preparing a draft of the Constitution for our new nation. Sherman's views on politics were shaped by Connecticut's position as an isolationist state. Connecticut operated without much need for the other colonies, using its own ports to trade with the West Indies instead of going through the ports in Boston. Additionally, Sherman's views were influenced by his Puritan beliefs. He opposed slavery, and he believed that it was already gradually being abolished and that abolition would eventually spread southward. But Sherman saw that this issue of slavery could threaten the success of the Constitutional Convention, and so he helped to shape compromises. Sherman was also known for the stand that he took against paper money, and he later opposed James Madison over the Bill of Rights. Sherman was also not a fan of the executive branch of government, suggesting that it was nothing more than an institution for carrying the will of the legislature into effect. Sherman feared that, quote, "the mass of people lacked sufficient wisdom to govern themselves, and thus wished no branch of the federal government to be elected directly by the people." In 1784, Sherman was elected as the first mayor of New Haven, an office which he held until his death. Sherman also served as a delegate to the 1787 Philadelphia Convention, which produced the United States Constitution. After Benjamin Franklin, Sherman was the second oldest delegate at the convention. After the Constitution was ratified, Sherman represented Connecticut in the United States House of Representatives. He then served in the United States Senate until his death in 1793, following a 2-month-long battle with typhoid. Jonathan Edwards, Jr. gave a funeral sermon for him. Roger Sherman is also a distant relative of the Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. Samuel Huntington also signed for Connecticut. He was a lawyer, a jurist, and a statesman. He signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. Huntington also served as President of the Continental Congress, President of the United States Congress, Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, and the 18th Governor of Connecticut, an office that he held until his death. In fact, Huntington was the first United States governor to die while in office. He had a short and limited education in the common schools. Beyond that, he was self-educated. When he was 16 years old, he was apprenticed to a cooper, but he also continued to help his father on the family farm. His education was largely a product of books that he borrowed from local lawyers and the books that he read in the library of Reverend Ebenezer Devotion. Huntington eventually married his mentor's daughter, Martha Devotion, in 1761. They remained together until her death in 1794. The couple did not have any children, but when his brother, Reverend Joseph Huntington, died, they adopted their niece and nephew. They raised Samuel Huntington, Jr. and Francis as their own. In 1754, Huntington was admitted to the bar and began practicing law. After a brief service as a selectman, Huntington began his political career in earnest. Then he suffered an attack of smallpox while serving in Congress. While he was not known for his extensive learning or brilliant speech, Huntington's steady hard work and his unfailing calm manner earned him the respect of his fellow delegates. As a result, when John Jay left to become the minister to Spain, Huntington was elected to succeed him as President of the Continental Congress in 1778. This is one reason why he is sometimes considered to be the first president. Huntington remained as President of Congress until July 9, 1781, when ill health forced him to resign. In 1782, Connecticut again named him as a delegate, but his health and judicial duties kept him from accepting. However, he returned to the Congress as a delegate for the 1783 session, in time to see the triumph of the Revolution immortalized in the Treaty of Paris. In 1788, Huntington presided over the Connecticut Convention that was called to ratify the United States Constitution. In his later years, he saw Connecticut transition to a U.S. state. He also resolved the issue of a permanent state capital at Hartford and oversaw the construction of the State House. Huntington even received 2 electoral votes in the first U.S. presidential election. He never owned slaves. Samuel Huntington died while in office on January 5, 1796. His nephew and adopted son, Samuel H. Huntington, Jr., eventually moved to the Ohio Country region, which he had been instrumental in opening up for settlement, and later he became the 3rd governor of Ohio. William Williams also signed for the colony of Connecticut. He studied theology and law at Harvard, but then he decided to fight in the French and Indian Wars. After the war, Williams opened up a store. He never owned slaves. Then at almost 40 years of age, he finally married and had 3 children. Williams was also very active in the Sons of Liberty protests that led to the Revolution. On July 1, 1774, 1 month after the Coercive Acts was passed to punish Boston, Williams anonymously published "To the King from America." This biting satire read in part, "We don't complain that your father made our yoke heavy and afflicted us with grievous service. We only ask that you would govern us upon the same constitutional plan, and with the same justice and moderation that he did, and we will serve you forever. And what is the language of your answer? Ye rebels and traitors, if you don't yield implicit obedience to all my commands, just and unjust, ye shall be dragged in chains across the wide ocean to answer your insolence. And if a mob arises among you to impede my officers in the execution of my orders, I will punish and involve in common ruin whole cities and colonies with their 10,000 innocents, and ye shan't be heard in your own defense, but shall be murdered and butchered by my dragoons into silence and submission. Ye reptiles, ye are scarce entitled to existence any longer. Your lives, liberties, and properties are all at the absolute disposal of my Parliament." End quote. Williams was elected to replace Oliver Wolcott at the Continental Congress on July 11, 1776, the same day that Connecticut received official word of the pro-independence vote of July 2nd. Though Williams arrived at Congress on July 28th, much too late to vote in favor of the Declaration of Independence, he still signed the formal copy. However, he later ignored the instructions of his constituents to vote against the ratification of the Constitution. Williams himself had only one sole objection to the document, which was the clause in Article 6 that bans religious tests for government officials. He died in 1811 at the ripe old age of 80. Oliver Wolcott was the final signer for Connecticut, and he was also the 19th governor of that colony. Wolcott was a major general in the militia during the Revolution, where he served under George Washington. He attended Yale, graduating as a top scholar in his class. Then he was granted a captain's commission so that he could raise a militia company to fight in the French and Indian Wars. After that, Wolcott practiced medicine with his brother, Alexander. He married Lorraine Collins, and they had 5 children together. His early support for independence led to him being given important roles during the war, both as a military leader and as a member of the Continental Congress. Wolcott was elected to the Continental Congress in 1775, but he became seriously ill in 1776, so he did not sign the Declaration of Independence until sometime after that. During the Revolution, Wolcott also saw extensive militia service. On August 11, 1776, he marched his men to join George Washington's army, where he was given command of New York's militia. He led between 300 and 400 volunteers to help General Gates and Benedict Arnold win the Battle of Saratoga, and over the course of the war he was known to show great disdain towards his enemy. Wolcott died at the close of 1797 when he was 71 years old. Lastly, Matthew Thornton was the third and final delegate to sign for the colony of New Hampshire, but he did not sign under the other two delegates from that colony. His name is the final one to appear on the Declaration of Independence. Thornton was born in Ireland, and he immigrated to the colonies at the age of 3. He was allowed to sign the Declaration 4 months after the formal signing. He then served in New Hampshire's militia as a physician and surgeon while holding the rank of colonel. He was the uncle of Captain Matthew Thornton, who was tried for treason after the Battle of Bennington for being a suspected loyalist, but he was found not guilty. Thornton fathered 5 children of his own and became a political essayist. He eventually moved and took up farming while he ran a family ferry. Thornton died at the age of 89 while visiting his daughter. I don't know about you, but I'm tired. And now I also have a major inferiority complex. So now that we can all fully appreciate the meaning of this day, and we've taken a moment to pay our respects to the incredible men who made it all possible, let's get ready to head outside to that sweet barbecue, enjoy a slice of fresh watermelon, and light up the night sky with some celebratory fireworks. And remember to send up a prayer of gratitude for the freedom that we enjoy. Happy 4th of July, my friends. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please help me build this podcast into a success by clicking like and follow, because that is what does the trick in making these things successful. And I hope you come back again next week. Until then, have a good week, my friends.